The war ended with a single, stark message. Hours after Germany's surrender in May 1945, the voice of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz reached the last boat still hiding under gray water. Stop hunting, surface, and hand yourselves to the nearest Allied ship. A long, silent war suddenly stepped into daylight, and the very machines built to vanish were ordered to be seen. A small fix, one day of orders, and the fate of hundreds of submarines swung in a new direction. Steel shadows rose all across the North Atlantic. In the Bay of Biscay, off Norway's fjords, and along the cold approaches to Britain, U-boats came up one by one, salt glaze on their decks and white cloths tied where the black flag once flew. Aircraft circled low. Destroyers fell in beside them. There was no chase anymore, only careful escort toward the harbors chosen for surrender. The wolf packs, so feared on winter nights, arrived in lines like quiet trains. At Loch Arabol in Scotland and Lisahally in Northern Ireland, the first groups came in under guard. Royal Navy and U.S. Navy teams climbed aboard with notebooks and calm voices. They took code books, maps, and any remaining weapons. Engineers walked the length of each deck, counting dents where depth charges had pressed the hulls and noting the state of pumps and batteries. Many of the boats looked tired. Paint peeled in long curls. Oil clung to their boots. Some crews stood at attention. Others leaned against the conning tower rail and stared at hills that had not seen them in years. By the week's end, the lines grew. In one Scottish anchorage, almost 40 U-boats lay bow to stern, a gray fence across the water. Tugs brought more from scattered ports. A few never reached the rendezvous. Valves failed, cables snapped, or a storm rolled a weak hull under. The Allies had what they needed: the boats, the papers, the people who knew how these machines had been pushed to their limits. Now came the hard choice: store them, share them, or remove them from the world altogether. The decision landed with cold logic. Keeping so many submarines afloat would cost money, dock space, and labor. Breaking them up would take years. And no one wanted the technology to drift into the wrong hands in the confusing months after peace. So Britain led a simple plan with a heavy name: tow the surrendered U-boats far into the Atlantic and sink them. Operation Deadlight would be the quiet final act of a long fight. Not a parade, not a headline, just work done in rough seas beyond the horizon. Winter came early to the tow paths. Groups of submarines left from Loch Ryan and Lisahally behind stout tugs, a destroyer or two keeping watch. The routes ended at 3 marked areas roughly 100 miles northwest of Ireland, named with plain letters: XX, YY, and ZZ. The job sounded simple. In practice, it was anything but. Many hulls had been abused by depth charge shock, hurried scuttling repairs, or months of salt and neglect. Ballast tanks leaked, engines seized, a tug line would tighten and sing, the sea would heave, and a deadweight boat would yaw like a door in the wind. The first days set the pattern. Some U-boats went down before they ever reached the scuttling lines, vanishing in whitecaps as a tow parted or a hatch gave way. Crews logged the losses, marked a position, and moved on. Others made the full distance. There, gunners and air crews turned the end into a controlled demonstration. Charges blew holes low and aft. Rockets struck the casing. A steel shape that had once taken weeks to find vanished in a minute, the bubbles rising and then smoothing to a gray, indifferent sea. Metal groaned under salt wind, but not every boat was marked for the deep. A handful were the shape of the future. The Allies chose to keep the newest designs, the long-range, streamlined submarines tuned for real underwater speed rather than brief dives. The Type 21 and its smaller coastal cousin, the Type 23, looked different even at a glance. Cleaner lines, larger batteries, a way of moving that belonged more to the world below the surface than above. These would not be targets. They would be teachers. Engineers in Britain and America walked through those boats with care. They ran submerged trials in quiet waters. They studied the snorkel that let diesels breathe while the hull stayed under. They traced how the new battery banks fed sustained speed rather than short sprints. In test notes, phrases repeat: smoother underwater handling, longer endurance, less noise. A boat designed in the last dark months of the war was already pointing toward the next era. You can almost feel the shift. yesterday's hunter becoming tomorrow's blueprint. Beyond the test piers, politics moved just as quickly. The major allies agreed that each of the three, United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union, would take a small number of surrendered boats for study, with the rest to be destroyed. Inspectors walked the rows in British waters, choosing which hull numbers would cross oceans and which would sail once more under new flags before being retired. Some smaller navies would receive a few as well, to restart training and rebuild after years of occupation. The rest would go the Deadlight way. What came next would echo for decades, far beyond the spray of those winter sinkings. For the crews who had sailed them, the waiting was slow. Many were questioned about engines, batteries, and torpedoes. Others sat out months unsure where they would be sent. By winter's end, most were repatriated to a country now divided and rebuilding from ruins. The machines they had served were already moving on, to the bottom, to test ranges, or into new uniforms with new numbers. What survived would quietly reshape how submarines were built and hunted in the years after, when a new tension settled over colder seas. But that turn would take time, and one last storm still stood between the boats and their appointed graves. Salt spray stung like glass in the towing crew's faces. A gray wall rose and fell, and with it the stubborn weight of a hull that did not want to be led. Then came the break, a muffled crack, a twist, and a sudden slack in the line. The dead boat rolled once, as if shrugging off its last duty, and slipped under with hardly a trace. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. Across December, the routine hardened. Chains of surrendered submarines left before dawn behind thick-hulled tugs, riding low and stubborn in dark water. The seamen learned to nurse the dead boats along, keep a steady angle to the swell, feed the line as the bow rose, take it back as the sea fell, and never allow a slack hawser to snap. Even so, winter took its share. Some hulls flooded through tired valves and never reached the plotted grids. Others rolled broadside, tore the bridle free, and vanished stern first in a boil of foam. The logbooks kept returning to the same spare entry, sank under tow, followed by a simple position and time. And that is how a fleet disappears, not with one dramatic moment, but with quiet losses written in neat ink. When a tow did reach the assigned squares, the ending felt like a ritual. The tug slipped the line. A destroyer moved ahead. Charges were set low. Gun crews stood by. Sometimes aircraft arrived and stitched the casing with small rockets to start the flood. In a minute, the bow dipped, the stern lifted, and the sea swallowed steel that had once stalked convoys. Salt hammered through open hatches. Air roared from vents like a final breath. Then the surface smoothed as if a chalk mark had been wiped away. You can almost feel the hull's last shudder as the deep took hold. Not every boat was marked for the deep. A handful of the newest designs were spared because they pointed forward rather than back. Trials crews in Britain and America took them out quietly, testing the snorkel's draw, the oversized battery banks, and the strange calm of true underwater handling. The notes from those runs are plain and careful. Steadier trim, longer endurance, less noise at patrol speed. The lesson was just as plain. Future submarines would live below, not above, and their hunters would have to learn a new kind of listening. Meanwhile, the Deadlight convoys pressed on. The towing crews ate standing and slept in short turns. Weather reports were read like prayers. The ships assigned to finish the targets felt the work in their bones. Bearings and elevations became muscle memory. By midwinter, the list of hull numbers had thinned. One after another, the last groups were taken to the gray squares on the chart and sent down. There were no speeches on the pier when the work was done, only a quiet understanding that something large had been ended cleanly. But the real storm hadn't even started yet. With disposal nearly complete, a very different process began in offices rather than anchorages. Inspectors met and divided the small share promised to each great power. 10 here, 10 there, 10 to the other side. A few more to partners trying to rebuild after occupation. The rest were recorded as lost to the Atlantic. The boats that were kept moved more slowly than the paperwork, crossing oceans under new rules and fresh paint. Sailors who later walked their decks in peacetime found them familiar in smell and shape, yet strange in purpose. A weapon without a war feels heavier in the hand. What the ocean did not claim, the engineers would. Western designers began shaping new boats with smoother lines, stronger batteries, and a habit of staying under. In the East, factories absorbed the same lessons and launched long runs of conventional submarines for colder stations. The old duel of the Atlantic turned into a quieter standoff. The weapons no longer stalked convoys at night. They waited in deep water to watch and to warn, a different sort of pressure that could be felt but not seen. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. A few submarines escaped both the scuttle list and the test ranges. Training commands needed real steel to teach young crews the weight of a hatch, the grit of a non-skid deck, and the cramped twist through a bulkhead. Smaller navies, rebuilding after years of occupation, took a handful under new flags to patrol harbors and shoal coasts. Weapons labs used other boats for measured blasts, timing how real plates rang and buckled so that later ships could survive worse. These were blunt lessons, but they saved lives that would never know they had been spared. All of it, from the white flags to the winter sinkings to the quiet test runs, flowed from a single order to surface. The war ended quickly. Its machines took months to lay to rest. By the time the gales eased, most had gone to the bottom, a few had become classrooms, and the rest were on their way to reshape the first designs of the Cold War. The sea was quiet again, but the ideas that rose from it were already moving at full speed. You can almost hear the low hum of that new age gathering in the background. Cold rain streaked the tow crew's coats as December deepened. By then, the lists were short enough to read at breakfast, and certain hull numbers carried quiet stories. One had slipped out in the final week of fighting, struck 2 small ships, then raised its white flag and joined the line. Now it waited like all the rest, important to no one but the men who had served her. Another left the Scottish anchorage behind a tug, took measured gunfire across the casing, and folded into the sea in a tidy arc. The entries were plain: scuttled as directed, position recorded, sea state rough. What Operation Deadlight proved, more than any speech, was how quickly a great fleet can vanish once the guns fall silent. Well over 100 surrendered submarines were tagged for disposal. Winter took many before the finish line. The Navy sent the remainder down at the grids. When the last dull thumps rolled across the chop in early February, the work was over. Years of construction and thousands of patrol days ended in a handful of cold weeks. For decades, no one bothered those places. Trawlers dragged their nets above them, and the plots on old charts meant little to anyone who wasn't there. Navies turned to new hull shapes and new engines, and the iron below slept under a quilt of silt. Then curiosity returned with better tools and questions. In the early 2000s, maritime archaeologists ran side-scan sonar over the Deadlight coordinates. One by one, the shapes sharpened into conning towers and broken rails. Cameras followed and showed boats sitting upright in the mud, their metal crusted but their lines still unmistakable. The sea had finished the job gently. The wrecks looked like ships pausing between patrols. While the Atlantic kept its silence, a quieter negotiation shaped the handful of boats spared in 1945. Inspectors from the 3 major allies chose which submarines to keep under a simple bargain. Each power would receive a small lot for study, and the rest would be destroyed. Britain and America pushed for the newest designs: cleaner hulls, larger batteries, and snorkels. The Soviet Union wanted them too. The war at sea was ending. A quieter contest was beginning. Trials in British waters produced notes filled with small, telling phrases. Underwater handling steady, turning circle improved at depth, battery endurance markedly longer. Crews wrote that a late-war German boat felt calmer below the waves than on top. An odd reversal for sailors raised on surface craft. American teams reached similar conclusions off New England. The lesson was plain even without numbers. If a submarine could stay under longer and move faster while hidden, every tactic built for older boats would need to be rewritten. Shipyards moved quickly. Designers on both sides of the Atlantic studied the outlines and built boats of their own. In Britain, new conventional classes arrived with smooth bows and a mindset that treated the surface as a place to cross quickly, not to linger. In the United States, post-war designs carried snorkels and bigger batteries. In the East, factories stamped out long series of conventional submarines for cold stations. The old duel of convoys and wolf packs gave way to a measured standoff of watchers in deep water. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. The most surprising survivors became something else entirely, museums that invite calm reflection. One ocean-going boat, captured intact during the war and hauled inland with great effort, now sits in a Midwestern city. Guides point to the radio room and the bunks above torpedoes. Children run a hand along rivets polished by decades of boots. In northern Germany, another survivor rests beside a tall naval memorial. Visitors step from bright sand into dim steel and lower their voices. Metal smells faintly of oil. The deck is colder than you think. Stand inside one of these hulls and you understand the tone of the old photographs. Voices drop of their own accord. Elbow room is measured in inches and sleep in snatches of minutes. History here is not just dates and decisions. It is the reach to a valve wheel and the bite of dry air. Some stories don't end. They fade into memory and keep breathing there. The final twist is that a design built for stealth created very public legacies. Most of the fleet lies hidden in cold mud, a cemetery marked mostly by coordinates. Yet a handful of boats, lifted onto cradles or kept afloat as exhibits, hold the faces and footsteps of millions who never sailed a day. Above and below, the post-war fate of the U-boats forms twin memorials. One is quiet and dark. The other is bright and loud, with school groups and veterans trading careful stories. Together they answer the question that started this journey. Most went under by choice, and by order, and a few were kept so the next generation could learn how to keep the peace that followed. The committee that decided which submarines would live a little longer met far from spray and diesel. 3 flags, 1 table, and a simple bargain. A small equal share for study. The rest to the deep. Inspectors walked along silent decks with notebooks tucked into coat pockets. Hull numbers were read out. Paint flakes brushed aside to find plates. The newest shapes drew quiet nods. Clean lines, big battery spaces, a breathing tube to let engines sip air while the boat stayed hidden. The choices told their own story. Keep what points forward. Return the rest to the sea. One ocean-going transport had surrendered with a cargo that read like a riddle from a darker plan. Precision parts, secret documents, and materials that hinted at weapons not yet seen on battlefields. It never saw combat's last weeks through. It surfaced, raised a flag, and gave itself up to a boarding team. Engineers took their time with that boat. They traced wiring with a fingertip. They measured storage spaces built for long runs to distant waters. When the lessons were written down and its purpose was spent, the vessel met a controlled end under the eyes of testers. A weapon without a war became a classroom and then a target, and even that left a note for later generations. Another late-war submarine wore a strange skin of rubberized panels meant to soften the echo of a searching pulse. Sailors called it by a dark nickname and swore you could feel the way it slipped through sound. After surrender, it crossed the ocean under new rules, endured a series of blasts and instrument checks, and finally settled into a riverbed as part of a study ground. Divers would find it long after and run a gloved hand across the textured plates, the old trick still there under silt. 2 larger, streamlined boats built too late to matter in combat showed a different world to Western crews. Their quiet power below the surface surprised even seasoned watchers. One ran demonstration dives that left observers more thoughtful than excited. Officials stepped aboard for short rides and came away speaking in calm tones about endurance and the feel of a steady helm at depth. The lesson on both sides of the Atlantic was the same. If a boat could truly live underwater, then search patterns, patrols, and the very idea of pursuit would have to change. Shipyards absorbed the news. Designers sketched bows that pushed water cleanly aside and hulls that didn't punish the sea for being dense. Batteries grew, snorkels became standard, Western fleets rolled out new classes that treated daylight as a thing to cross, not a place to linger. In printed brochures, the words were muted: improved submerged performance, reduced acoustic profile, but what they meant was simple. The surface was now the exception. In the East, a vast program turned those ideas into long runs of conventional submarines for cold stations. Yards learned the rhythm of laying down and launching a smooth-bellied boat again and again. Doctrine shifted to match. Patrols under ice, listening posts along far coasts, the quiet movement of watchful hulls across narrow seas. If the old duel of convoy and raider had been about finding and stopping, the new tension was about knowing and waiting. No headlines announced this change, but it touched every chart room and sonarman's headset. What came next would rewrite everything they thought they knew. Even nations with small budgets found use in the surrendered steel. Training commands needed real decks to teach a young sailor the weight of a hatch and the reach to a red valve wheel. Coastal patrol units learned on boats that wore new numbers over old welds. In a few places, engineers sliced open a retired hull like a loaf to show how men had slept above torpedoes and worked in spaces no wider than a man's shoulders. Visitors peered in and shook their heads at the bunks stacked like drawers. You can almost feel their heartbeat in that silence. Not every story ended in a museum or a test range. Weapons labs used some captured hulls to time how real plates buckled when a blast rolled past. The data did not look like heroism, but it saved lives that never knew what had been learned for them. Other boats, too tired for any use, were towed offshore and set down with clean charges, marked on a chart, and left to become quiet reefs where cold water fish turned corners that men once squeezed through. By the turn of the decade, most of the retained submarines had done their duty in peacetime and were retired with little ceremony. Yard workers with torches and cranes finished what winter storms and gunnery had started. The technology had already moved on into the first modern fleets. The influence of those late war designs showed up in places you couldn't point to on a pier. A new curve to a bow, a steadier feel at periscope depth, a hunt for silence in gears and pumps. Numbers in manuals mattered more than names welded to plates. For those who visit the survivors, memory arrives in small details. The faint sugar smell of old paper in a radio nook. A chalk mark on a bulkhead no one has washed away. A dent in the deck where boots always turned left around a hatch. At a museum in a city far from any sea, the guide pauses by a cramped sleeping space and explains that a full crew meant no one owned a bed. Men slept in shifts, warm from the last person's body. In northern sand, a different boat rests beside a high memorial stone. The air outside is bright and windy, but inside the hull it is cool and still, as if time had tucked itself in and closed the door. What happened to the U-boats after the war is simpler and stranger than rumor. Most were sunk by decision and design in those short, hard winter months. A chosen few were kept to teach, to test, and to seed the next generation of boats on both sides of a new divide. And a handful became places where people come to understand how narrow life can be when steel and water agree to meet. Stand there long enough, and the noise of crowds fades. Somewhere below, in dark water off a distant coast, a row of hulls still sits upright in the mud, patient and unchanged. Even now you can hear the echo of that night. By early winter the last tows were already planned, and the crews who had done this work for months could sense when a hull would behave and when it would fight. A boat with a tired bow would yaw with each swell. One with a stiff rudder would track like a stubborn cart. The sea taught a simple rule: if the line sang too high for too long, something would fail. And when it did, there was no drama, only a sharp crack, a lurch, and a void where a boat had been a heartbeat before. What remained after the sinkings was not only wreckage, but a library of lessons. Gunnery officers compared notes on what broke a pressure hull fastest. Divers studied how steel tore when a shaped charge bit low near the keel. Towing masters wrote calm lines about angles and patience that read like proverbs. None of it made headlines. All of it altered the way future crews would fight their boats and survive when fights were lost. On the piers, young engineers walked into a new world. Designs now assumed that a submarine lived most of its time below. Batteries were no longer an afterthought. They were the heart of the boat. Cabling for silent motors ran like arteries. The snorkel, once a curiosity, became a basic feature, the steel throat that let diesels breathe without showing a wake. In training rooms, instructors made a small point that landed with weight. Depth was not a hiding place anymore, it was home. In offices where maps were pushed with fingertips, other decisions followed. If submarines would stay under longer, then the ships that hunted them had to change how they listened. Wide sweeps gave way to focused patience. Rushes toward contact turned into slow, layered searches that could last for days. Crews learned to trust new instruments and to doubt sudden certainty. A false echo could waste a week. A single clean note, held and held, could redraw a patrol line across an ocean. For sailors in small navies restarting their lives, the surrendered boats were classrooms on hulls. A training officer would stand in a narrow passage and explain how to live in a space where every lever mattered and every sound carried. Recruits learned to move in a rhythm that kept elbows clear and feet quiet. They memorized the heat of a valve wheel and the rough feel of non-skid under their palms. The goal was not romance. It was competence, and then calm. Museums were not yet on anyone's mind. The world was busy, and those who had survived wanted work and ordinary days. Yet a few people began to save pieces. Nameplates, periscope heads, and dial faces worn smooth at the edges. A captain kept a logbook whose last pages smelled of diesel. A dockyard worker set aside a small brass tag from a bunk hook. These scraps became the first anchors for exhibits built decades later, when the noise had settled and curiosity came back in gentler clothes. Years after the last sinkings, when deep-diving cameras returned to the Deadlight plots, the images felt like dreams. A deck gun leaned at an angle as if waiting for a hand that would never come. Railings held their curves. A hatch stood ajar in perfect stillness. Silt lay on every flat surface like snow that never melted. The sea did not care about flags or orders. It simply kept what was given and returned an outline of it, softened and quiet. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. The story also moved inland where survivors stood on cradles. One ocean-going boat in America became a long lesson in logistics before it became a lesson in history. Streetlights reflected on its casing as it was towed through a city to a building made for it alone. Workers lowered it into a concrete bed like laying a ship into sleep. In Germany, a wartime design found a final berth beside a tall memorial and the open Baltic. Visitors walked up the sand and stepped down into cold steel and narrow light. Inside, the senses do the teaching. The tang of old oil sits above the clean smell of paint. The floor seems to pitch even when the hull is still, because your memory supplies the motion. Voices drop to a whisper. Guides point to bunks and explain hot bunking, a rotation where a bed was never quite empty. People nod and look again, as if counting the inches between metal and pillow could make the past easier to hold. You can almost hear a kettle click and a pencil tap on a chart. The last truth is not grand, and that is why it stays. Most of the submarines surrendered after the war were sunk by plan in winter seas. A chosen few were kept to patch gaps in knowledge and to seed better designs. A handful were saved so that children could stand where men once worked by red light and learn what closeness feels like at sea. Between the boats in museums and the boats in mud lies the full answer to the question the title asks: what happened to them? They ended in 3 quiet ways: teaching, testing, and sinking, and each path still speaks softly when you listen for it. The Cold War did not announce itself with a cannon shot. It arrived in memos and shipyard schedules. In design offices, engineers drew smoother bows and longer battery racks. In briefing rooms, officers learned to think of the ocean not as a highway, but as a layered world of sound. Charts sprouted quiet zones and listening lines. A patrol could last weeks without a periscope rising once above the chop. The lessons taken from late-war German boats did not appear as trophies. They lived in curves of steel and in habits that crews carried like second nature. Western fleets moved first on paper and then in steel. New boats launched with snorkels as standard and a habit of staying down. Crews practiced slow approaches under electric power and measured retreats that left little wake. Maintenance logs recorded the care of batteries as if they were living things. Instructors repeated the same calm warning at the start of each cruise. Speed is a luxury. Silence is survival. The theme was the same in every language spoken below deck. Across the line of new alliances, factories set to work on long runs of conventional submarines built for northern waters. Their hulls carried the family look, clean, rounded forms that cut noise and kept speed under control. Training films showed the same movements: trusted bearings, quiet trim changes, and a steady hand on ballast. A small group of late-war ideas had become the common grammar of an entire era. The enemy's best lessons had become everyone's homework. Even as navies modernized, nations with modest resources found room for a few surrendered hulls. They used them to train young crews, to patrol shoals and straits, and to relearn skills lost during years of occupation. Paint changed, numbers changed, the work did not. A sailor learned how to sleep in a space that was not quite his, and how to move through a doorway without scraping a shoulder. They learned to count breaths when air grew stale and to treat quiet as a tool rather than an absence. It wasn't pageantry, it was patience learned the hard way. Not all retained boats served for long. Once the lessons were taken, many were sunk cleanly as targets so that weapons crews could see real effects on real steel. Timing fuses, impact angles, and shock waves were no longer theory. Divers later found the test hulks and traced the paths of pressure with their hands. Data tables that saved lives began as dents and torn plates on those quiet wrecks. Some stories don't end. They fade into memory and keep working there. Meanwhile, the public's view of the U-boat changed shape. During the war, the submarines were shadows under bad news. After the war, as museums opened and veterans told careful stories, the boats became places where families could walk and ask questions. Guiding a grandchild through a narrow passage is a different kind of victory. It does not erase what happened at sea. It makes room for understanding. The bright day above and the cool air below share the same exhibit. Inside the preserved boats, practical details do most of the talking. How many men fit in a galley no wider than 2 outstretched arms? How watch rotations felt when night and day meant little. How condensation beaded on frames and dripped like a slow clock. A guide points to a chart desk scarred by pencil marks and explains that a straight line meant hope on rough days. People run their fingers along the edge and smile without quite knowing why. For a moment, time just stopped breathing. Far offshore, the Deadlight wrecks lie where towing crews left them. Fish move through companionways where sailors once turned sideways to pass. Storms roll above, unheard. The sea gives back little and takes nothing quickly. What matters is not treasure, but testimony. The coordinates on the chart are a kind of sentence with the subject left out. Is, was, rests. A century will not change that grammar much. So the answer stretches between 2 kinds of quiet. On land, steel preserved for hands and eyes, telling a hard story without raising a voice. At sea, steel kept by depth and silt, telling the same story by simply being where a compass points. Between them runs a line of influence that reached into the first nuclear boats and beyond, a line you cannot see from a pier but can feel in the way modern submarines move and hide. Maybe that is how change begins, quietly. Numbers help us keep score, but they do not hold the whole picture. More than 30,000 German submariners did not return from the war at sea, and thousands of Allied sailors never reached home because of the torpedoes those boats sent. The steel that survived now stands in quiet rooms and along windy beaches to remind us. Museum plaques carry long lists and small lettering. Veterans trace the names with a fingertip. Children ask whether anyone could really sleep above a live torpedo and whether the air ever felt new. The answer comes with a half smile. You slept because you were tired, and the air felt new whenever a hatch opened to the world. What changed after the war, beneath policy and planning, was the tone of the conversation about submarines. The fear that once framed every headline softened into a sober respect for what the ocean demands from anyone who goes down into it. That respect crosses uniforms and languages. A sailor who served on one side can stand inside a former enemy's hull and recognize the smell of oil, the weight of a wrench, and the ache of a long watch. Memory, like pressure, finds its own level in close spaces. Walk through one of the preserved boats, and you see why the design mattered. The streamlined casing does not catch your eye as much as the way the passages lead your body. There is a logic to the cramped order. The ladder angles. The lockers sit where hands can find them in blackout conditions. The battery deck has a feel underfoot like steps in an old church. So many feet have crossed that the metal itself seems smooth with memory. Even steel remembers the storms that shaped it. The story also lives in smaller countries that took a handful of surrendered boats and made them earn a living in peace. Coastal patrols learned to respect reefs and shoals more than enemy cruisers. Training cruises taught discipline with no speeches. One minor mistake in a narrow channel could become a day of hard work for an entire crew. When those boats were finally retired, dockyard workers saved a nameplate, a control handle, and a clock. They knew that a ship's soul is a matter of details, not tonnage. They carried those pieces home in lunch pails and jacket pockets, small tokens that later became labels in glass cases. Research divers who visit the Deadlight wrecks speak of an odd feeling. The boats do not look defeated, they look paused. Many sit upright as if waiting for orders, their shapes softened by silt and time. Fish flicker through companionways. A railing ends where a rope once led to a tug that is now only a line in a logbook. The appeal is not morbid. It is the calm of an unfinished sentence. The sea holds the rest and does not feel hurried to say it out loud. All of this loops back to a single human question. What do we keep, and what do we let go? The Allies chose to let most of the U-boats go to the bottom, to keep a few as teachers, and to let an even smaller number become public rooms for memory. The results are everywhere and nowhere at once. You can buy a ticket to one of the survivors and stand under rivets that outlived their designers. You cannot visit the quiet fleet offshore unless you accept that visiting means never seeing, only knowing. There is one more thread worth holding. Those late war designs influenced how the first nuclear submarines were drawn and handled. Even when reactors replaced batteries as the beating heart, the lessons of quiet water, clean shapes, and disciplined movement still applied. When you hear a modern submarine described as fast and silent, you are also hearing an echo of a design drawn in the last hard months of a lost cause. History did not end there. It just paused to breathe. The closing image is simple. A winter sea heaves under a low sky. A tug steams home on a short line. Behind, the last bubbles of air fade where a hull has slipped away. Far inland, a child steps out of a museum's dim passage into daylight and asks a question about a bed and a torpedo. Between those two moments runs the full distance of the answer. Most of the U-boats were sent down by plane. Some taught us how to build better boats and how to find them. A handful became places where we speak softly and listen. What happened to the German U-boats after the war can be told in 3 quiet answers. Most were towed into rough Atlantic weather and sunk on purpose, a clean end chosen to keep the peace that followed. A smaller number were kept as teachers stripped of secrecy so engineers could learn what mattered. A hull that slips through water batteries that carry a boat for hours without air and habits that keep noise low enough to be lost in the sea's own voice. And a few became rooms where people walk slowly and read small labels, places where memory trades fear for understanding. If you stand in one of those rooms, the past feels near. A guide points to a narrow bunk and explains the rhythm of watches. A child asks how anyone could live like this. In the pause, the ocean seems to return. Memory holds. The boat is still, yet you feel motion under your feet. Metal remembers. Offshore, the quiet fleet remains where winter left it. The coordinates lie beyond fishing grounds and ferry lanes. No one visits as a tourist. The sea keeps the wrecks as if keeping a promise, to soften sharp edges, to bury noise, to hold a line of hulls upright in the dark like sentries at ease. When cameras go down, they bring back a view that looks less like ruin and more like rest. Silt settles, fish turn, a railing shadows the sand like a sundial that no longer needs the sun. Why does this story still hold us? Because it mixes endings with beginnings. The scuttlings closed one chapter with deliberate finality. The testing opened another, pointing toward submarines that would define a tense peace for half a century. The museums bridged both, allowing strangers to step into the narrow spaces where history felt personal rather than abstract. Above the waterline and below it, the same lesson repeats: power matters, but so does restraint. So the answer to the title is clear and human. They were sunk, they taught, and they endure. They left a track from wartime fear to wartime memory, and from memory to measure, designs drawn straighter, patrols planned with greater care, and crews trained to respect the deep. Somewhere, far from any harbor, a cold swell passes over a silent hull. Somewhere else, a classroom of visitors files through a steel corridor and lowers its voice without being told. And maybe that is the final word. Some endings don't close. They echo,